May 1st, 1960, 8:36 in the morning, local time. The Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, known today as Yekaterinburg, sits in the Ural Mountains approximately 1,400 kilometers east of Moscow. The city contains sensitive military production facilities that Soviet security services guard zealously, including factories producing intercontinental ballistic missiles and components for Soviet strategic weapons programs, 70,500 feet above the city, more than 13 miles high. Well into the stratosphere, where the sky appears dark blue verging on black, Francis Gary Powers flies his Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance aircraft on a heading that will take him north toward Plesetsk, and eventually to exit Soviet airspace near Murmansk. Powers has been airborne for more than 9 hours total, having departed Peshawar, Pakistan, before dawn. He's been inside Soviet airspace for more than 2 hours, his route taking him across Afghanistan into Soviet Central Asia, over the Tyuratam missile test range where Soviet ICBMs launch, and now across the Urals toward facilities in the Soviet north. The Hycon B camera, mounted in the U-2's equipment bay, operates continuously, exposing frame after frame of high-resolution film that captures Soviet facilities in extraordinary detail. From 70,500 feet altitude, the camera's 36-inch focal-length lens provides resolution approaching 1 meter, sufficient to identify specific buildings, count vehicles, determine facility purposes, and analyze construction details that reveal what activities occur at each site. Powers monitors his instruments, airspeed, altitude, engine parameters, oxygen supply, camera operation status, while maintaining the straight and level flight path necessary for optimal photography. The U-2's glider-like aerodynamics make it sensitive to control inputs at this altitude, where the air is so thin that the wing barely generates lift. Small corrections with the yoke produce large aircraft responses, requiring delicate touch to maintain stable flight. Powers knows Soviet forces are tracking him. U-2 missions over Soviet territory have never been undetected. Soviet radar picks up every overflight, tracks the aircraft throughout its time over Soviet territory, and undoubtedly alerts air defense units to scramble interceptors. But for 4 years, Soviet interceptors haven't been able to reach U-2 altitude. MiG-19 fighters that constitute the bulk of Soviet air defense forces have service ceilings around 55,000 feet, 15,000 feet below where Powers flies. Even the newer MiG-21 interceptors specifically designed to counter high-altitude threats struggle to reach 60,000 feet under ideal conditions, still 10,000 feet short of U-2 operating altitude. Powers and other U-2 pilots have occasionally seen Soviet interceptors far below them, climbing desperately toward altitudes they can't reach, pilots pushing their engines to the limits, trying to intercept the American reconnaissance aircraft that fly overhead with apparent impunity. At 0836 hours, Major Mikhail Voronov, commanding an SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile battery positioned near Sverdlovsk, receives the engagement order his crews have trained for, but never previously executed. Soviet Air Defense Command has been tracking this particular U-2 overflight since Powers entered Soviet airspace near the Afghan border, passing tracking data from one radar station to the next as the aircraft proceeded northward. The SA-2 system, specifically designed to engage high-altitude targets that Soviet interceptors can't reach, has been operational for less than a year. The first 13 SA-2 missiles miss. The U-2's small radar cross-section, extreme altitude, and the missile's proximity fuse, difficulties detecting targets at such height, all contribute to the failures. But the 14th missile's proximity fuse detonates approximately 20 meters behind Powers' aircraft. The expanding cloud of shrapnel from the warhead strikes the U-2's tail section, severing control surfaces and puncturing the fuselage. Powers feels the aircraft shudder, hears explosive decompression as the thin air at 70,000 feet rushes into the now breached fuselage, and watches his instrument panel as indications confirm catastrophic damage. The U-2 enters a spin, rotating around its longitudinal axis while descending rapidly, centrifugal forces pinning Powers against the side of his cramped cockpit. Powers attempts emergency procedures, trying to restart the flamed-out engine, attempting to level the aircraft, but the U-2 is unrecoverable. As altitude decreases and the aircraft continues spinning, Powers realizes he needs to eject before the increasing air density creates forces that will make ejection impossible. The U-2's ejection seat is designed for upward ejection through the canopy, but at 70,000 feet altitude in a spinning aircraft, the procedure carries substantial risks. Powers manages to release his seat restraints and open the canopy, but centrifugal force prevents him from reaching the self-destruct switches that would arm charges designed to destroy the camera and sensitive equipment. At approximately 15,000 feet altitude, Powers is thrown clear of the aircraft. His parachute deploys automatically, and he descends toward Soviet territory below, landing in a field near Sverdlovsk. KGB forces arrive within 30 minutes, taking Powers into custody and securing the crash site, where U-2 wreckage has impacted largely intact. To understand why this shoot-down represented both Soviet triumph and American intelligence success, despite the diplomatic disaster it created, you need to understand the 4 years of U-2 operations that preceded May 1st, 1960, and the comprehensive intelligence those operations provided. The U-2 program originated in 1954 when American intelligence agencies recognized they needed overhead reconnaissance of Soviet territory to assess actual Soviet military capabilities versus propaganda claims. Soviet Union was a closed society where foreign observers couldn't access military facilities, where aerial photography from aircraft was impossible without violating Soviet airspace, and where intelligence collection relied primarily on signals, intercepts, defector reports, and analysis of Soviet publications, sources that couldn't provide a comprehensive picture of Soviet strategic forces. President Eisenhower worried particularly about Soviet claims of massive ICBM deployment that could give Soviet Union decisive strategic advantage. But American intelligence couldn't confirm or refute these claims without seeing Soviet ICBM sites directly. The solution Lockheed Aircraft's Skunk Works division proposed was radical: develop aircraft that could fly higher than any Soviet interceptor could reach, equipped with cameras providing resolution sufficient to identify military facilities from extreme altitude. The aircraft, designated U-2, would need range to penetrate deep into Soviet territory, altitude capability beyond Soviet air defense reach, and payload capacity to carry sophisticated camera systems. Kelly Johnson, leading the Skunk Works team, designed aircraft optimized entirely for these requirements, with minimal concern for conventional aviation priorities like speed, maneuverability, or pilot comfort. The U-2A that emerged from development between 1954 and 1955 resembled a powered glider more than a conventional aircraft. The 80-foot wingspan, extraordinarily long for an aircraft with 49-foot fuselage, provided lift necessary to reach extreme altitudes where air density approached near vacuum conditions. The camera systems the U-2 carried represented equally sophisticated technology. The Hycon B camera used during early missions incorporated 36-inch focal length lens, a massive optical system that required substantial space in the equipment bay. From 70,000 feet altitude, this camera could resolve objects smaller than 1 meter, providing detail sufficient to identify specific aircraft types on airfields, count vehicles and motor pools, read large text on buildings, and analyze facility layouts that revealed operational purposes. The camera could expose 2,500 frames per mission, creating comprehensive photographic coverage of Soviet territory along the aircraft's route. Later cameras, including the Perkin-Elmer Type B, provided improved resolution and stereo imaging capability that allowed analysts to determine heights of buildings and objects through parallax analysis. Pilot requirements for U-2 operations were demanding. The partial vacuum at 70,000 feet meant pilots wore full pressure suits, essentially personal spacecraft, providing pressurized environment that kept pilots alive if cockpit pressure failed. Pure oxygen breathing was mandatory because air pressure was too low for normal respiration. Physical endurance requirements were substantial. Pilots sat in cramped cockpits for 12-plus hour missions with minimal ability to move, eating pre-packaged food through ports in their pressure suit helmets, and managing waste through uncomfortable relief systems. The selection process for U-2 pilots emphasized physical fitness, psychological stability, and ability to operate independently over hostile territory for extended periods, knowing that capture would mean imprisonment or worse. The CIA operated the U-2 program through detachments positioned strategically around Soviet periphery. Detachment A operated from Wiesbaden, West Germany, providing access to Western Soviet territory. Detachment B operated from Incirlik, Turkey, covering southern Soviet areas, including missile test ranges in Central Asia. Detachment C operated from Atsugi, Japan, targeting Soviet Far East facilities. These positions allowed U-2 aircraft to penetrate Soviet territory from multiple directions, photographing facilities that couldn't all be covered from single base. Mission planning for each overflight involved detailed route calculations designed to photograph priority intelligence targets while minimizing risk. CIA analysts identified specific facilities requiring photography: suspected ICBM sites, bomber bases, submarine construction yards, nuclear facilities, industrial plants. Routes were calculated to pass over these targets while avoiding known surface-to-air missile sites after SA-2 deployment began in 1959, and providing egress routes toward friendly territory if mechanical problems forced premature mission termination. The overflight procedure typically involved transiting to Soviet border at 40,000 feet, climbing to maximum altitude upon entering Soviet airspace, maintaining altitude throughout the overflight, typically 3 to 6 hours over Soviet territory, and descending only after exiting Soviet airspace. The intelligence treasure the U-2 program provided between 1956 and 1960 fundamentally reshaped American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. The photographs revealed actual Soviet ICBM deployment was minimal. The Plesetsk and Baikonur sites that U-2 photographed showed only 4 operational R-7 ICBM launch facilities operational by 1960. Soviet propaganda had claimed hundreds of ICBMs deployed, creating fears in America of a missile gap, where Soviet strategic forces supposedly exceeded American capabilities. U-2's photography proved these claims were false. The United States had deployed 18 Atlas and Titan ICBMs by 1960, with production continuing, while Soviet operational ICBM force consisted of 4 R-7 launchers at 2 sites. The missile gap existed, but it favored America rather than the Soviet Union. Strategic bomber assessments showed similar disparities between Soviet claims and reality. Soviet Aviation Day displays in 1955 had shown formations of Myasishchov M4 Bison bombers that Western observers interpreted as evidence of massive bomber production. U-2 photography of Soviet bomber bases revealed actual long-range bomber forces numbered approximately 150 M-Bavor and Tupolev Tu-95's Bear aircraft total. Substantial force, but far short of the 600-plus bombers Soviet propaganda claimed. The Aviation Day displays had flown the same aircraft repeatedly past reviewing stands, creating illusion of numbers that didn't exist in operational forces. Naval facility photography at Severodvinsk and Komsomolsk-na-Amur revealed Soviet submarine construction rates were approximately 40% of American intelligence estimates. The photographs showed specific submarine hulls under construction, allowing analysts to count actual production and estimate completion timelines. This intelligence informed American naval planning and helped right-size American submarine construction programs that had been ramped up based on inflated estimates of Soviet production. Nuclear test site photography at Semipalatinsk provided detailed intelligence about Soviet nuclear weapons development. The photographs showed test shot craters, instrumentation arrays, and facility configurations that allowed American analysts to estimate weapon yields, identify test shot types, atmospheric, underground, underwater, and confirm Soviet thermonuclear capability while assessing the sophistication of Soviet weapons designs. Soviet frustration with U-2 overflights grew with each mission, as Soviet air defense forces proved unable to intercept the high-flying reconnaissance aircraft. The first U-2 overflight on July 4, 1956, was tracked by Soviet radar from the moment it entered Soviet airspace. Soviet efforts to develop interceptor aircraft capable of reaching U-2 altitude resulted in crash programs including the MiG-21 design specifically optimized for high-altitude interception. By 1959, MiG-21 interceptors achieved service ceilings around 60,000 feet under ideal conditions, closer to U-2 altitude, but still short by 10,000 feet or more. Experimental interceptors, including the Sukhoi T-3, attempted even higher altitudes, but a 1956 interception attempt resulted in engine failure at 62, or 0 feet, when the prototype couldn't get sufficient oxygen for combustion at that altitude, forcing the pilot to eject. Khrushchev's private frustration with the U-2 overflights is recorded in his memoirs, where he describes the humiliation of knowing American spy planes flew over Soviet territory at will, that Soviet forces tracked them on radar throughout their flights, but that Soviet air defenses couldn't stop them. The admission that Soviet air defense, supposedly among the world's most capable, couldn't intercept a single-engine reconnaissance aircraft, embarrassed Soviet military leadership and undermined Soviet claims of technological prowess. The SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile system developed between 1957 and 1959 specifically addressed the high-altitude interception challenge. The system used command guidance, where ground-based radar tracked both the missile and the target, with ground computers calculating intercept geometry and transmitting guidance commands to the missile via radio link. The missiles could reach altitudes exceeding 80,000 feet, providing margin above U-2 operational altitude. First operational deployment occurred in 1959, with nationwide deployment accelerating through early 1960. CIA intelligence tracked SA-2 deployment through various sources, and U-2 mission planning after 1959 attempted to route around known SA-2 sites, though comprehensive coverage eventually made this impossible for deep penetration missions. The May 1, 1960 mission that ended with Power's shoot-down was designated Operation Grand Slam and represented the most ambitious U-2 overflight attempted. The route would take Powers from Peshawar, Pakistan, across Afghanistan into Soviet Central Asia, over the Tyuratam missile test range, northeast across the Urals to Sverdlovsk, north to Plesetsk, and finally exit near Murmansk to land in Bodo, Norway. The mission would photograph 3 of the Soviet Union's most sensitive military facilities: the ICBM test range at Tyuratam, missile production at Sverdlovsk, and operational ICBM deployment at Plesetsk, in a single flight covering more than 3,000 miles of Soviet territory. The timing was critical. President Eisenhower was scheduled to meet Soviet Premier Khrushchev at a summit in Paris on May 16th, and American intelligence wanted current photography of Soviet strategic sites to inform Eisenhower's negotiating positions. Powers departed Peshawar at 06:20 local time, climbing to cruise altitude as he transited Afghanistan. He entered Soviet airspace near the Afghan border at 07:33 and immediately climbed to 7,500 feet, near the U-2, its maximum altitude for the weight and atmospheric conditions that day. Soviet radar detected the border penetration immediately, and Air Defense Command began tracking the flight as Powers proceeded northward. The route took him over Tyuratam, where the Hycon B camera photographed the test range facilities, recording launch pads, support infrastructure, and vehicle assembly buildings. Soviet SA-2 batteries along Powers' route received alerts but held fire. The long-range missiles needed to engage from ahead of the target his flight path to achieve optimal intercept geometry, and batteries positioned behind or beside Powers' route couldn't engage effectively. As Powers approached Sverdlovsk, his altitude had decreased slightly to 7,500 feet due to fuel burn and atmospheric conditions. Major Voronov's SA-2 battery defending Sverdlovsk was positioned ahead of Powers' route, providing optimal engagement geometry. When Air Defense Command issued the engagement order, Voronov launched his battery's complete ready inventory, 14 missiles, in rapid succession. The salvo approach wasn't standard doctrine, but Voronov recognized this might be his only opportunity to intercept a U-2, and he committed every available weapon to maximize intercept probability. The missiles climbed toward Powers' altitude, their rocket motors accelerating them beyond Mach 3 as they reached 70,000 plus feet. The first 13 missiles missed for various reasons. Proximity fuses failed to detect the small target. Tracking radar had difficulty maintaining lock on the U-2's minimal radar cross-section, and intercept calculations contained errors from estimating target altitude and speed precisely. But probability favored the salvo approach. With 14 missiles fired, at least one achieved geometry close enough that its proximity fuse detected the target and detonated. The 14th missile exploded approximately 20 meters behind and slightly below Powers' U-2. The expanding shrapnel cloud struck the tail section, severing control cables and puncturing the thin aluminum skin. The U-2 immediately became uncontrollable, entering a spin that Powers couldn't recover from. His attempts to restart the engine failed because the spin created forces that prevented fuel from reaching the engine properly. As the aircraft descended through 30,000 feet, Powers realized ejection was his only option, but the spin prevented him from reaching the self-destruct panel to arm the charges that would destroy sensitive equipment. Powers eventually managed to open the canopy and was thrown clear of the spinning aircraft around 15,000 feet altitude. His parachute deployed automatically, and he descended toward Soviet territory, landing in a field where local residents and quickly arriving KGB forces took him into custody. The U-2 wreckage impacted nearby, the camera and film largely intact despite the violent descent. CIA planners had assumed that the self-destruct charges would destroy sensitive equipment in any shoot-down scenario, and that, if the pilot ejected at 70,000 feet, the thin air would prevent successful parachute deployment, meaning the pilot would not survive to be captured. Powers' inability to activate the self-destruct due to the spin and his ejection at lower altitude where the parachute functioned properly meant Soviet forces recovered both pilot and equipment, a comprehensive intelligence compromise that CIA had never anticipated. The diplomatic aftermath unfolded over several days as both sides calculated their responses. Initially, the United States issued cover story claiming a NASA weather research aircraft had been missing over Turkey, possibly having strayed off course due to oxygen system failure that would have incapacitated the pilot. NASA displayed a U-2 painted in civilian markings, reinforcing the weather research cover. On May 5th, Khrushchev revealed at a press conference that Soviet forces had shot down an American aircraft over Sverdlovsk, but he deliberately withheld that the pilot had been captured alive. The announcement was designed to allow American officials to continue the cover story, which they did, claiming the missing aircraft had been on weather research mission. On May 7th, Khrushchev revealed the full truth. Soviet forces had captured the pilot alive, recovered the aircraft wreckage, including camera and exposed film, and possessed definitive proof that the United States had been conducting espionage operations over Soviet territory. Khrushchev displayed photographs from the recovered film showing Soviet military facilities, and he presented pieces of the camera system and other equipment. The evidence was irrefutable. President Eisenhower, confronted with proof that contradicted the cover story, made the unprecedented decision to admit publicly that the United States had been conducting aerial reconnaissance over the Soviet Union, arguing that such operations were necessary to prevent surprise attack and maintain peace through verified knowledge of Soviet capabilities. The Paris summit scheduled for May 16th collapsed before it began. Khrushchev demanded that Eisenhower apologize for the overflights, promised to end them and punish those responsible. Eisenhower refused to apologize, though he did announce that U-2 overflights of Soviet territory would cease. Khrushchev walked out of the summit, and the incident contributed to deteriorating East-West relations throughout 1960 and into 1961. The diplomatic damage was substantial, but from intelligence perspective, the U-2 program had already accomplished its primary objectives by providing comprehensive photography of Soviet strategic facilities between 1956 and 1960. Powers was tried in Moscow in August 1960 in a show trial where he was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He served 21 months before being exchanged for Soviet KGB Colonel Rudolf Abel, who had been arrested in the United States in 1957 and convicted of espionage. The exchange occurred on February 10, 1962, on the Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin to Potsdam, a location that became famous as the Bridge of Spies, and served as exchange point for numerous Cold War spy swaps. The U-2 program's impact on American strategic planning extended far beyond the immediate intelligence the photographs provided. The comprehensive knowledge of actual Soviet ICBM deployment allowed American planners to size American strategic forces based on real threats rather than worst-case scenarios. The missile gap that dominated American political debate in 1960 was proven false by U-2 intelligence. During the presidential campaign, John F. Kennedy used the missile gap as campaign issue, but after his election, CIA briefed him with U-2 intelligence showing American strategic advantage. The briefing changed Kennedy's perspective on the strategic balance and influenced his defense policies. Arms control negotiations throughout the 1960s were enabled by U-2 intelligence that gave American negotiators confidence in their understanding of Soviet capabilities. Without verification of what Soviets actually possessed, negotiating arms limitations would have been impossible because neither side could trust the other's declarations. U-2 photography provided verification that made negotiations feasible. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 demonstrated the continued value of U-2 reconnaissance when photographs from a mission over Cuba revealed Soviet missiles being deployed there. The intelligence allowed President Kennedy to respond with the naval blockade while having accurate knowledge of what Soviet forces had actually deployed versus what Soviet claims suggested. The crisis resolution depended fundamentally on Kennedy having reliable intelligence about the threat he faced. Successor programs developed in response to U-2's demonstrated vulnerability to SA-2 missiles included the SR-71 Blackbird, which flew at Mach 3+ speeds at altitudes exceeding 85,000 feet, fast enough to outrun surface-to-air missiles even if detected. Corona reconnaissance satellites provided another solution, orbiting in space, immune to air defense systems, photographing Soviet territory without violating airspace. Both programs built on lessons learned from U-2 operations about what intelligence was valuable and how to collect it effectively. The U-2 itself continued operations, though overflights of Soviet territory ended after May 1960. The aircraft flew missions over China, Cuba, and other targets where either Soviet air defenses weren't present or where missions could be justified as operating in international airspace. Peripheral reconnaissance flights along Soviet borders collected electronic intelligence from radar emissions and communications intercepts without entering Soviet airspace. The basic U-2 design proved so effective for high-altitude reconnaissance that variants continue operating today, more than 65 years after the original design flew. The current U-2S incorporates modern sensors, communications, and avionics while maintaining the basic airframe that Kelly Johnson designed in 1954. No other reconnaissance aircraft has served continuously for so long, testimony to the fundamental soundness of the design concept. Francis Gary Powers' experience after his exchange and return to the United States was complicated by questions about whether he had done everything possible to destroy his aircraft and sensitive equipment. Some criticized him for not activating self-destruct charges or for not remaining with the aircraft to ensure its destruction. Investigations concluded that the spin prevented Powers from reaching the self-destruct panel, and that his decision to eject and preserve his own life rather than die with the aircraft was correct. Powers was formally cleared of any wrongdoing, though public perception remained mixed. He worked as a helicopter pilot and consultant after leaving CIA service and died in 1977 in a helicopter crash while working for a television station in Los Angeles. In 2000, on the 40th anniversary of the shootdown, Powers was posthumously awarded the Prisoner of War Medal, Director's Medal, and Distinguished Intelligence Cross by CIA, formally recognizing his service and acknowledging that earlier criticism had been unjustified. The SA-2 Guideline missile system that shot down Powers' U-2 became standard Soviet air defense system and was exported worldwide. The same SA-2s would later engage American aircraft over North Vietnam, where they achieved numerous shootdowns throughout the Vietnam War. American Wild Weasel defense suppression tactics developed specifically to counter SA-2 threats. and the ongoing competition between surface-to-air missiles and aircraft countermeasures continues shaping air warfare today. The May 1st, 1960 shoot-down proved that high-altitude flight alone couldn't guarantee invulnerability. Adequate surface-to-air missiles with good tracking radar could engage aircraft at any altitude aircraft could practically reach. The historical significance of the U-2 program extends beyond specific intelligence collected to demonstrate that overhead reconnaissance could provide comprehensive strategic intelligence that shaped national policy and military planning. The 4 years of U-2 operations from 1956 to 1960 provided American leadership with accurate understanding of Soviet strategic forces during a period when Soviet propaganda was making extravagant claims designed to intimidate the West. The photographs revealed truth that Soviet claims were inflated, that American strategic position was stronger than Soviet position, and that Soviet conventional force advantages in Europe weren't matched by strategic nuclear advantages that could offset American capabilities. The Powers incident itself, while diplomatically damaging, didn't fundamentally change the intelligence situation because the critical intelligence had already been collected. Soviet attempts to preserve secrecy about their ICBM deployment, bomber forces, submarine production, and nuclear facilities had been comprehensively defeated by 1960. The photographs that Powers' camera captured before the shoot-down and the thousands of frames collected during previous missions gave American intelligence a comprehensive picture of Soviet military capabilities that informed American strategy throughout the Cold War. When Major Voronov's 14th SA-2 missile exploded near Powers' U-2 at 7,500 feet over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, it ended 4 years of Soviet frustration watching American reconnaissance aircraft photograph Soviet territory while being unable to stop them. KGB had tracked every U-2 mission, knew exactly what facilities were being photographed, and understood that Soviet attempts to maintain secrecy about military capabilities had failed comprehensively. The shoot-down gave Soviets satisfaction of finally intercepting a U-2, and it created a diplomatic crisis that embarrassed American government. But by May 1960, Soviets had no secrets left to protect. U-2 cameras had already photographed everything American intelligence wanted to see. The intelligence those photographs provided shaped American understanding of Soviet capabilities, influenced strategic planning, enabled arms control negotiations, and demonstrated that technological innovation could defeat even the most extensive security measures closed societies could implement. KGB knew U-2 flew overhead. Couldn't stop it until May 1960. By then, Soviets had no secrets left to protect.